Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I work as a paranormal investigator. I downloaded an app on the deep web that leads to abandoned places. I think I might found aliens. Hey everyone. Long-time lurker, first-time poster. I never thought I'd have a story worth sharing here, but what's been happening to me lately feels like something straight out of a horror movie, and I need to get it off my chest. I'm not even sure where to start, so I guess I'll go from the beginning. So a little backstory. I've been working as a paranormal investigator for about 5 years now. It's not as glamorous or exciting as it sounds. Most of the time, it's just me sitting in dark rooms with a few pieces of equipment, trying to debunk creaky floorboards or flickering lights. But every now and then, something genuinely creepy happens that makes all the dull moments worth it. You know, the kind of stuff that makes you question your own sanity. But recently, I started feeling like I was hitting a wall. The cases were becoming too predictable, and I felt like I was just going through the motions. I needed something new, something different to reignite that spark. That's when I started hearing whispers about the deep web. Yeah, I know, not exactly the safest place to be browsing, but I'd heard that there were all sorts of hidden gems there. Forums discussing paranormal theories, rare books on occult practices, even some obscure software designed to track supernatural activity. After a few days of contemplating, I decided to take the plunge. I'm not going to lie. I was nervous as hell, but curiosity got the better of me. I used a VPN and downloaded Tor, and soon enough, I was browsing sites that were definitely not meant for the average internet user. Most of it was just the usual sketchy stuff. Illegal marketplaces, bizarre conspiracy theories, you name it. But after a couple of hours, I stumbled across something that caught my eye. It was a forum thread titled, "The Black Pyramid, Secret Government Tech, or Alien Artifact." Intrigued, I clicked on it and started reading. The thread was filled with people discussing this strange piece of software that supposedly led people to hidden, abandoned places around the world, places that weren't on any map. The catch? These locations were rumored to be connected to the Black Pyramid, an alleged alien artifact that the government had been trying to cover up for decades. Now, I'm not one to believe in aliens. Ghosts, sure. Demons, maybe. But aliens? Not really my thing. But something about this thread hooked me. The people talking about it weren't your usual tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists. They seemed credible, professionals even. Some claimed to be former government employees. Others claimed to be researchers with the degrees in fields I can't even pronounce. One post in particular stood out to me. It was from a user named Nemo42, who claimed to have found a copy of this mysterious app on a hidden deep web server. According to him, the app, called Wayfinder, used some sort of advanced algorithm to locate these abandoned sites connected to the Black Pyramid. He went on to say that he had visited a few of these locations and had seen things that defied explanation. Structures with impossible architecture, strange lights in the sky, and once, something that looked like a person, but wasn't quite human. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing I had been looking for. Something new, something different. Against my better judgment, I replied to Nemo42, asking how I could get my hands on this Wayfinder app. He responded within minutes, sending me a link to a page that required a password to access. He gave me the password and warned me to be careful. saying that some doors shouldn't be opened. I should have listened, but of course, I didn't. I downloaded the app. It was a small file, just a few megabytes. When I opened it, there was no flashy interface, no instructions, just a black screen with a single button that said, "Begin." I hesitated for a moment, then clicked it. The screen flickered, and then a map appeared. It looked like Google Maps, but with a few key differences. The map was covered in red pins, each one marking a location. Some were in the middle of nowhere, deep in forests or deserts. Others were in cities, but still in places that didn't seem like they'd have any significance. Abandoned factories, old train stations, forgotten alleys. I zoomed in on one of the pins, and the app provided coordinates along with a brief description. Site #047, former military base, decommissioned in 1978. Last known use, testing facility for classified technology. Below that, there was a note. High levels of electromagnetic interference detected. Proceed with caution. It was all too weird, but I was hooked. I decided to pick a location close to me, just to see if there was anything to this. One of the pins was only about a 2-hour drive away, deep in a forest that I knew had been mostly untouched for decades. The description was vague. Site #112, unknown structure, reports of unusual activity in the area, potential Black Pyramid connection. The next morning, I packed up my gear and hit the road. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I mean, how could I explain it without sounding like a total lunatic? I told myself it was just a routine investigation, something to shake up the monotony of my usual cases. But as I got closer to the location, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind started to grow. The deeper I drove into the forest, the more isolated I felt. The road turned from pavement to gravel, and eventually it was little more than a dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. The trees grew thicker, the branches casting long twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air felt heavy, like I was driving into something I couldn't see. Finally, the app pinged, and I reached the coordinates. I parked the car and stepped out into the dense, silent woods. According to the map, the structure was about a mile's hike from where I was. I grabbed my flashlight, my EMF detector, and my camera, then set off into the trees. As I walked, the silence around me was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. The deeper I went, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was like the forest itself was watching me, waiting for me to reach my destination. And then, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, I saw it. Through the trees, partially obscured by overgrowth, was a structure. But it wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't a building or a bunker. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. And that's when the real nightmare began. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the structure in front of me. It wasn't a building, not in the traditional sense. It looked more like a massive obsidian monolith, about 15 feet high, with a smooth, polished surface that reflected the dim light filtering through the trees. The thing was jet black, with no seams, no windows, no doors, just a solid, towering presence that seemed to absorb the light around it. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of art installation, maybe something left behind by an eccentric millionaire, or a government project gone wrong. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The way the monolith just sat there, in the middle of the forest, felt wrong, like it had been deliberately placed in a spot where no one was supposed to find it. I slowly approached, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But curiosity won out. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to leave without figuring out what the hell I was looking at. As I got closer, I noticed that the air around the structure felt different. It was colder, and there was a strange low hum that I could feel more than hear. My EMF detector started going haywire, the needle spiking into the red zone the closer I got. I'd seen readings like this before, but never this strong, and certainly not in a place like this. I reached out and touched the surface of the monolith. It was smooth and cool to the touch, almost too smooth, like it wasn't made of any material I was familiar with. But what really freaked me out was the way it vibrated ever so slightly under my hand, like it was alive, like it was aware of me. I jerked my hand back and took a few steps away, my heart pounding in my chest. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, trying to calm down, trying to think rationally. Maybe it was just some kind of advanced technology, something experimental that had been abandoned out here. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't make sense. This wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, and the fact that it was here, in the middle of nowhere, made it even stranger. That's when I noticed something else. The forest around me had grown even quieter, if that was possible. The air was still, and there was this sense of emptiness, like the world had shrunk down to just me and this monolith. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I decided I needed to document this before doing anything else. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures, but when I looked at the screen, the images were distorted, glitches and static where the monolith should have been. I switched to video mode and hit record, but the same thing happened. The camera just couldn't capture it, like it wasn't really there, or like it was somehow interfering with the electronics. I felt my pulse quicken as I lowered the camera. If I couldn't document this thing, then who would believe me? I couldn't even believe what I was seeing, and I was standing right in front of it. But before I could think too much about it, something even stranger happened. The hum coming from the monolith grew louder, more intense, and I started to feel lightheaded. The world around me seemed to tilt, and the trees, the ground, even the monolith itself, began to blur at the edges, like I was looking at them through frosted glass. I staggered back, clutching my head as a wave of nausea hit me. And then, for just a moment, I saw something in the reflection on the monolith's surface, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a figure, tall and slender, with long limbs and a featureless face. It was standing right behind me, but when I spun around, there was nothing there, just the empty forest, silent and still. But when I looked back at the monolith, the figure was still there, standing in the same spot, his head tilted slightly, as if it was watching me. I blinked, and the figure was gone, the reflection showing only the trees and the sky behind me. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger, like there were eyes on me from every direction. I tried to steady myself, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Whatever I had seen, it was real, and it had been right behind me. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't leave without understanding what this thing was. I pulled out my phone and opened the Wayfinder app again, hoping it might give me some clue, some explanation for what I was dealing with. But when I looked at the map, the pin for this location was gone. It was as if the app no longer recognized that I was here. Or maybe it didn't want me to leave. Panic started to set in. I tried refreshing the app, but it froze, the screen flickering with static before going completely black. I was about to turn and run when something else caught my attention. A faint glow coming from the base of the monolith, like a pulse of light deep within the structure. I stared at it, torn between my instinct to flee and the overwhelming need to know more. The light pulsed again, stronger this time, and I could feel it in my chest, like it was syncing with my heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I took a step closer. That's when I heard it, a voice, low and whispery, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't speaking any language I recognized, but somehow I understood it. It was telling me to come closer, to touch the monolith again, to let it in. I stumbled back, terrified, my mind racing. What the hell had I gotten myself into? This wasn't just some abandoned structure or forgotten piece of tech. This was something else, something far beyond my understanding, and whatever it was aware of me. I didn't stick around to find out what would happen next. I turned and bolted, sprinting back through the trees as fast as I could. The forest that had been so quiet before was now alive with sound, the crunch of leaves under my feet, the wind howling through the branches, and that same low hum, now a roar in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding like it was about to burst out of my chest. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, desperate to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure again, standing on the road behind me, or worse, sitting in the back seat. I made it home just as the sun was setting, but the fear didn't go away. It followed me inside, lingering in the corners of my apartment, in the dark spaces where the light didn't quite reach. I tried to distract myself, to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But when I checked my phone, the Wayfinder app was still there, and the map was back, now with a new pin in a different part of the world. And that's when I knew I wasn't done with this. Whatever this monolith was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't going to let me go that easily. I spent the next few days in a state of uneasy anticipation, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The image of that black monolith haunted me, along with the figure I'd seen reflected in its surface. I tried to focus on my usual work, hoping it would distract me, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pulse of light, felt that hum vibrating through my bones. The Wayfinder app was a constant reminder that something was waiting for me. I considered deleting it, but a part of me, maybe the same part that had led me to download it in the first place, couldn't let it go. I needed answers, even if I was terrified of what those answers might be. One evening, after a particularly restless day, I sat on my couch with my phone in hand, staring at the app's icon. My thumb hovered over it, my mind torn between fear and curiosity. Eventually, curiosity won out, as it always seemed to. I opened the app, and the map loaded quickly, almost eagerly, as if it had been waiting for me. The new pin was in a completely different location, halfway across the country, in a small town I'd never heard of. The description was brief. Site hash 234. Abandoned hospital. frequent reports of unexplained disappearances, possible Black Pyramid connection, an abandoned hospital. My heart sank at the thought. Hospitals already creeped me out at the best of times, but an abandoned one? That was the stuff of nightmares. But the mention of the Black Pyramid piqued my interest. If this site was connected to the same phenomenon as the monolith, maybe I could start piecing together what was going on. Against my better judgment, I booked a flight and packed my gear. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a huge mistake, that I was walking into something I couldn't handle. But by then, it was too late to turn back. I needed to know the truth. The flight was uneventful, but as soon as I landed in that small town, the sense of dread returned, stronger than ever. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, with an unsettling stillness that made my skin crawl. I rented a car and drove to the hospital's location, my heart pounding with every mile. The hospital was just as ominous as I'd imagined. It was a massive, decaying building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown trees and crumbling pavement. The windows were shattered, the doors boarded up, and the whole place reeked of abandonment and despair. It was the kind of place that seemed to absorb light, leaving only shadows and dark memories behind. I parked a short distance away and sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to psych myself up. My hands were trembling as I checked my equipment, making sure everything was in working order. Camera, flashlight, EMF detector, all set. I took a deep breath, then another, and finally forced myself to get out of the car. The entrance to the hospital was a gaping hole where the doors had once been. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and rot, and the silence was almost oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. As I moved deeper into the building, the temperature seemed to drop. My breath fogged in front of me, and the beam of my flashlight flickered sporadically. I could hear the faint echo of my footsteps, but they didn't seem right, like they were being distorted, stretched out in a way that didn't make sense. I found myself in what must have once been the main lobby. Old rusted chairs were scattered around, along with piles of debris and broken equipment. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it just the usual nonsense, but some of it more disturbing, symbols and words that I didn't recognize. Yet they filled me with a deep sense of unease. I pulled out my EMF detector, and sure enough, the needle was jumping all over the place. This wasn't like any of my previous investigations. The energy here was different. It wasn't just the usual spikes or fluctuations. It was more chaotic, almost alive, like the building itself was aware of me. As I moved further into the hospital, I started to notice things that made my stomach churn. There were old, yellowed papers scattered across the floor, some of them medical records, others handwritten notes in shaky, desperate handwriting. One of them caught my eye. It was a letter, half finished, addressed to someone named Anna. The writing was frantic, barely legible, talking about the voices and the lights in the sky, and how they were coming. The last line was smeared, like the person had been pulled away before they could finish. I stuffed the letter into my bag, not really sure why. Maybe it was just the need to hold on to something tangible, something that connected me to reality in this twisted place. I kept moving, but the deeper I went, the worse the feeling in my gut became. Eventually, I found myself in what looked like an old operating room. The tiles were cracked and stained, the metal table in the center rusted and covered in dust. There were more of those strange symbols on the walls, along with deep scratches, as if someone or something had tried to claw their way out. But what really caught my attention was the object in the middle of the room, on the table. It was another monolith, smaller than the one I'd seen in the forest, but identical in every other way. The same black polished surface, the same unnatural smoothness, and the same low hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. This time, though, there was no hesitation. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures, but just like before, the images came out distorted, the monolith barely visible through the static and glitches. I switched to video, but the same thing happened. Frustrated, I stepped closer, reaching out to touch it again, hoping to feel that vibration, that sense of life. But before I could, the room went pitch black. My flashlight died, plunging me into darkness so complete, it was like I'd been swallowed whole. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. The hum from the monolith grew louder, filling the room, filling my head until it was the only thing I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, my flashlight flickered back on, but I wasn't alone anymore. Standing on the other side of the room, just at the edge of the light, was a figure. It was the same one I'd seen in the reflection of the first monolith, tall, slender, with long limbs and no discernible features. It stood there, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. It was like being stared down by something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. Then the figure did something that made my blood run cold. It raised one of its long, thin arms and pointed at me, just pointed, with a finger that seemed impossibly long, as if it was mocking me, claiming me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, with fear, as the figure slowly began to move closer. Each step it took was deliberate, almost methodical, and with each step, the hum in the room grew louder, more intense. I was sure it was going to touch me, to do something unspeakable, when suddenly, the door to the operating room slammed shut. The figure stopped, inches away from me, and just stood there, its head tilted to one side, like it was listening for something. The next moment, the hum stopped, and the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving me alone in the cold, silent room. My legs finally found their strength, and I bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway as fast as I could. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I stumbled to my car, threw my gear in the back, and peeled out of there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. As I drove back to the hotel, the events of the night replayed in my mind over and over, each time more terrifying than the last. But the worst part was the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Not really. Whatever that figure was, whatever the monoliths were, they weren't done with me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And deep down, I knew that I would be drawn back, just like before. I'd been marked, and no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape whatever was coming. After my encounter at the abandoned hospital, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, looming closer, its presence like a shadow I couldn't escape. The hum of the monolith echoed in my head, a relentless reminder that this wasn't just some nightmare I could wake up from. Whatever was happening to me, it was real, and it was far from over. I spent the next few days in a fog, jumping at every small noise, feeling like something was always just out of sight, watching, waiting. I couldn't focus on anything else. My regular cases piled up, unanswered emails, missed calls. I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was figuring out what these monoliths were and what they wanted from me. The Wayfinder app became an obsession. I'd open it dozens of times a day, searching for new pins, new locations, but nothing new appeared. Just the same pins I'd seen before, like the app was taunting me, daring me to revisit those places. But I couldn't bring myself to go back, not yet. I needed answers, and I didn't think I'd find them at those sites. I started digging into the deep web again, trying to find more information about the Black Pyramid, about the monoliths, about that figure. I spent hours on obscure forums, reading posts from people who claimed to have encountered similar things, cryptic messages, half-finished theories, most of them too vague or outlandish to be of any real use. But then, buried in a thread from years ago, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a post by a user named The Seeker, who described an experience eerily similar to mine. He talked about finding the Wayfinder app, about visiting locations marked by the pins, and about seeing the same monoliths and figures. But he went further, detailing how, after several encounters, the monoliths began to appear to him in his own home, first in his dreams, then in waking life. The Seeker claimed that the monoliths were not just alien artifacts, but gateways, portals to another dimension or reality where these figures resided. He believed they were trying to pull him through, to bring him into their world, and that the more he interacted with the monoliths, the closer he came to that fate. His final post was a frantic plea for help, saying that the figures had started appearing in his mirrors, in the corners of his vision, always closer, always reaching for him, and then he disappeared. No more posts, no activity, nothing. It was like he'd vanished off the face of the earth. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking. If what the Seeker said was true, I was in way over my head, but I couldn't just walk away. I'd opened the door, and now it wouldn't close. The monoliths, the figures, they had their grip on me, and they weren't letting go. I spent the next night with all the lights on, too afraid to let darkness take hold. But around midnight, something changed. The air in my apartment grew heavy, oppressive, like a storm was about to break. The lights flickered, dimmed, then went out completely, plunging me into a darkness so thick it felt suffocating. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a notification from the Wayfinder app. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, the screen casting a weak glow in the pitch black. A new pin had appeared, but this one was different. It wasn't in some remote location, wasn't an abandoned building or forgotten stretch of forest. It was right here, in my town, just a few blocks away. The description was chillingly simple. Convergence point. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what a convergence point was, but I had a feeling it wasn't anything good. My mind raced, torn between the need to get out of there and the overwhelming compulsion to go, to see for myself what this was all leading to. In the end, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The pull was too strong, like a magnet drawing me in. I grabbed my flashlight and my phone, and without even thinking, I was out the door, heading into the night. The streets were deserted, the town eerily quiet. As I walked, the air grew colder, and that same low hum started to build, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. My breath fogged in front of me, and I felt a familiar sense of unease, like I was being watched. The pin led me to an old disused factory on the edge of town. The building was massive, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. It had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era, and now it loomed over me like a decaying giant. The entrance was a gaping hole where the doors had once been. I hesitated, feeling that hum vibrating in my chest, stronger now, more insistent. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting long, jittery shadows on the cracked concrete floor. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery, broken conveyor belts, and piles of debris. I navigated through the wreckage, following the hum as it grew louder, leading me deeper into the heart of the factory. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, but they weren't alone. I could hear something else. Whispers, soft and indistinct, just on the edge of hearing, like voices carried on the wind. And then I saw it. In the center of the factory floor, surrounded by toppled machines and shattered glass, was the largest monolith I had seen yet. It towered over everything, its surface impossibly smooth, impossibly dark, absorbing all light and sound. The hum was deafening now, reverberating through the entire building, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. But it wasn't just the monolith that made my blood run cold. There were figures, dozens of them, standing around the monolith in a loose circle. They were just like the one I'd seen before. Tall, slender, featureless, their bodies barely more than shadows in the dim light. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, their attention focused on the monolith, as if they were waiting for something. I took a step back, but my foot hit a piece of debris, sending it clattering across the floor. The sound echoed through the factory, and all at once, the figures turned to look at me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Their faces, if you could call them that, were blank, smooth surfaces, but I could feel their gaze, feel the weight of their attention on me. The hum grew louder, almost unbearable, and the monolith began to glow, a deep, pulsating light that seemed to come from within, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. The figures started to move, slowly at first, then with more purpose, closing in on me from all sides. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. The light from the monolith grew brighter, and I felt something pulling at me, like invisible hands grasping at my mind, my soul, trying to drag me towards that impossible, black void. Just as I thought I was about to be consumed, something snapped inside me. Maybe it was pure survival instinct. Maybe it was sheer terror, but I broke free of whatever was holding me and turned to run. I sprinted through the factory, the figures' whispers chasing me, growing louder, more frantic, like they were calling out to me, pleading with me to come back. I burst out of the factory and into the night, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. The whispers faded, but the hum lingered, a low, throbbing pulse that seemed to follow me as I ran all the way back to my apartment. When I finally slammed the door behind me, I collapsed against it, my whole body shaking. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. Monoliths, the figures, whatever they weren't done with me yet. The convergence point. It was just the beginning. And I had a sinking feeling that wherever this was leading, I might not survive it. The days following the convergence point were a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me, that every shadow in my apartment, every flicker of light, was a harbinger of the inevitable. The figures, The monoliths. They were no longer just distant horrors. They were here, in my life, in my mind. I avoided the Wayfinder app, hoping that if I ignored it, I could somehow escape the grip it had on me. But deep down, I knew it was futile. This wasn't something I could outrun or hide from. It was too late for that. Whatever was happening, I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. One night, as I sat in the darkness of my apartment, the silence was broken by a soft, almost imperceptible vibration. It wasn't coming from my phone, but from something deeper, something within me. The hum. It had returned, not as a sound, but as a sensation, reverberating through my bones, my mind. It was like a silent call, a pull that I couldn't resist. I knew what I had to do, though the thought terrified me. I had to face it. Whatever it was, whatever awaited me, I couldn't keep running. If I didn't confront this, it would consume me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. With trembling hands, I opened the Wayfinder app one last time. The map loaded instantly, but there was only one pin now, directly on top of my current location. The description was blank, just a single word that sent a shiver down my spine. Finale. I don't know what I expected, but the word carried a weight that settled heavily in my chest. This was it, the endgame, the conclusion of whatever twisted path I had been set on. And there was no avoiding it. I grabbed my gear, though I wasn't sure what good it would do, and left my apartment, the hum growing stronger with every step I took. The streets were eerily empty, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I followed the app's guidance, each step feeling like it was leading me further away from reality, deeper into something I couldn't comprehend. The app guided me to the outskirts of the town, to a place I'd never been before. It was an old quarry, long abandoned and overgrown with weeds and thick brush. The moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light that seemed to blur the line between the real and the unreal. I stood at the edge of the quarry, looking down into the pit below, and there it was, waiting for me, the largest monolith yet, towering over the quarry floor, its surface gleaming with that same impossible blackness. The hum was almost overwhelming now, a physical force that made my head throb and my vision blur. And surrounding the monolith were the figures, hundreds of them, standing silently, their heads tilted upward as if in worship. But they weren't looking at the monolith. They were looking at me. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to run, to turn back and never look at this place again. But I couldn't. I had to see this through, to understand what was happening, even if it destroyed me. I made my way down into the quarry, each step feeling heavier than the last. The figures didn't move as I approached, but I could feel their eyes on me, or whatever passed for eyes in those blank, featureless faces. The closer I got to the monolith, the more the air seemed to thicken, like I was walking through water, each breath a struggle. When I finally reached the base of the monolith, I stopped, staring up at its massive, towering form. The hum was so loud now that it was all I could hear, a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through every cell in my body. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the hum stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. So profound that it was almost deafening. The figures, the monolith, everything seemed frozen in that moment, as if time itself had come to a standstill. And then the monolith began to glow. It started as a faint, barely visible light, deep within the blackness, but it grew quickly, spreading outward until the entire surface was pulsating with a dark crimson glow. The figures surrounding me began to move, slowly at first, then faster, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. I backed away, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in around me, their featureless faces reflecting the crimson light of the monolith. I could feel the air crackling with energy, a force that seemed to reach out from the monolith, wrapping around me, pulling me in, and then the voice came. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It didn't speak in words, but in feelings, emotions, concepts that flooded my mind all at once. It was ancient, vast, and utterly alien, something that my human mind could barely comprehend. It spoke of things beyond time, beyond space, of realities layered on top of each other, intersecting and diverging in ways that defied all logic. It told me that the monoliths were not gateways, but beacons, signals sent out across the multiverse, drawing those who were attuned to their frequency. The figures were not beings, but shadows, echoes of something far greater, far more powerful. And I was a receiver, someone who had been marked, chosen to be a conduit for their will. The light from the monolith grew brighter, the figures closing in until they were only inches away, their presence overwhelming, suffocating. I felt the force from the monolith pulling at me, trying to draw me into that crimson light, into whatever lay beyond. And then, just as I thought I was about to be consumed, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was survival instinct. Maybe it was pure terror, but I fought back, pushing against the force with everything I had. I wasn't ready to become a part of whatever this was, to lose myself in that endless void. The light flickered, the figures hesitated. For a moment, the pressure lessened. I took that moment and ran, bolting through the circle of figures, scrambling up the side of the quarry, the hum rising to a deafening pitch behind me. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I just ran, driven by a primal need to escape, to survive. I don't know how I made it out of that quarry, how I got back to my car, but somehow I did. I drove until I couldn't drive anymore, until I was far, far away from that cursed place. The hum faded, the pull lessened, but the terror remained, a cold, gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. I finally stopped at a motel on the edge of some nameless town, too exhausted to go any further. I collapsed on the bed, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But there were no answers, only more questions, more fear. I deleted the Wayfinder app, hoping that would end it, but I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't. The monoliths, the figures, they had found me, marked me, and they weren't going to let me go. Not really. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. I can't go back to my old life, can't pretend that any of this didn't happen. I don't know how much time I have left before they find me again, before the hum returns and the monoliths call to me once more. All I know is that whatever they are, whatever they want, it's not over. It's only just beginning. My brother works as a gatekeeper in Area 51. I think he is not human. I've always had a close relationship with my older brother, Kyle. He's the kind of guy who you could count on for anything. Smart, strong, protective. Growing up, we did everything together. And even as adults, we stayed tight despite living miles apart. He went off and joined the military right after high school, and I took a more conventional path, ending up in a boring office job. We stayed in touch, of course, but life got in the way, and our conversations grew less frequent over time. So when I got a call from him last month, it was a bit of a surprise. The weird thing was, it wasn't like his usual calls. There was something different in his voice, something cold. It was as if he was going through the motions of talking to me, but he wasn't really there. "Kyle," I had asked after he said hey, and then nothing for solid 10 seconds. "Yeah, it's me," he finally replied, but his voice sounded distant, like he was on speakerphone or standing at the end of a long hallway. "How's it going?" It wasn't like him to be so detached. Kyle was always engaged, always present, but that day he seemed off. I shrugged it off as just another rough day at work for him maybe, but it gnawed at me for the rest of the evening. He told me he'd been stationed somewhere in Nevada. Area 51, he joked, with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. I laughed too, but it felt hollow. We both knew there was a kernel of truth in every joke. We exchanged the usual updates, how our parents were doing, my new apartment, his life on base. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just his tone, it was what he wasn't saying, like he was hiding something. I chalked it up to military secrecy, some classified mission he couldn't talk about. But there was something else too, something almost eerie. Toward the end of the call, he paused again, longer this time. I could hear the wind howling through the phone. It was weird because it sounded like he was outside, but he always called from indoors. I asked him where he was. "I'm at work," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's night shift. Just watching the gate." I remember frowning at that. Watching the gate. I didn't know what he meant by that, but before I could ask, he cut me off. "Listen, if anything happens, if you don't hear from me for a while, just take care of yourself, okay?" My heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about, Kyle? Is something going on?" "Nah, nothing like that. Just, life's unpredictable and all that." Another pause. "Take care of yourself, bro. And don't come looking for me if I go off the grid. Promise me that." I laughed it off, thinking he was messing with me. "Come on, Kyle. You know I'd come looking for you. You're my brother." "Promise me," he insisted, his voice suddenly sharp, almost desperate. I promised, if only to calm him down. He said he had to go and hung up abruptly, leaving me sitting there with the deadline humming in my ear. For a while, I just stared at the phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That night, I barely slept. The conversation played over and over in my head, each replay making me more uneasy. What could be so bad that he'd ask me not to look for him? And why did he sound so scared? I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that Kyle was probably just tired or stressed. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, and I had no idea just how wrong things were about to get. The days after that phone call felt like I was living in a haze. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, tried to focus on work and my daily routine, but it was like there was this constant nagging anxiety gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking just around the corner, waiting for me to let my guard down. A week went by, and I hadn't heard from Kyle again. That wasn't too unusual. He'd gone silent before when he was busy, and I'd always joked that he was off on some top secret mission. But this time, it was different. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be bad news, some military officer telling me there had been an incident. And then, exactly 10 days after our last conversation, I got a package. I remember the moment so clearly. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was lounging on the couch, scrolling through random YouTube videos, trying to distract myself. When the doorbell rang, I jumped up, more out of relief at the interruption than anything else. A chance to break the monotony. I opened the door to find a delivery guy holding a medium-sized brown cardboard box. There was no return address, just my name and address written in black marker. My first thought was that it was something I'd ordered online and forgotten about, but when I looked closer, I noticed the handwriting. It was Kyle's. "Sign here," the delivery guy said, shoving a clipboard in my direction. I scribbled my name and took the box, feeling a strange chill run down my spine. It wasn't heavy, but there was something unsettling about the way it felt in my hands, almost like it was wrong. As soon as I closed the door, I set the box on the kitchen table and just stared at it for a while, unsure of what to do. My brother had never sent me anything before, and the fact that it arrived without warning only added to the creeping sense of dread. I finally grabbed a knife and carefully cut through the tape, the sound of the blade slicing through the cardboard echoing in the silent room. When I opened the flaps, I found a plain manila envelope sitting on top of what looked like a thick black notebook. The envelope had my name scrawled across it in the same familiar handwriting. Hands shaking, I tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a letter from Kyle, but the handwriting was more erratic than usual, like he'd been in a hurry or afraid. The message was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "If you're reading this, something's happened to me. Don't contact the base. Don't go looking for me. Just read the notebook and do exactly what it says. Trust no one." My breath caught in my throat as I read and reread the words, trying to make sense of them. What the hell was going on? What had Kyle gotten himself into? I dropped the letter onto the table and reached into the box for the notebook. The cover was smooth, almost leathery, and there were no markings or labels on it. I hesitated for a moment, but then flipped it open to the first page. The handwriting was Kyle's, but it was clear that he'd written it in a state of panic. The words were scribbled in a way that made them hard to read, and there were smudges where the ink had run, as if he'd been sweating or crying. Entry 1. I don't have much time. They're watching me. They know I'm trying to warn you. If you're reading this, you need to know the truth. About Area 51. About the gate. I blinked, my mind racing. The gate. What the hell was he talking about? Entry 2. They're not who they say they are. The guards, the personnel, they're not human. I've seen it with my own eyes. At night, when they think I'm not watching, they change. Their eyes, their skin, even their voices. They shift into something else, something inhuman. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I read those words. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A prank. But I knew Kyle better than that. He wasn't the kind of guy to mess around with something like this. And besides, the fear in his writing was palpable. I turned the page, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Entry 3. I've seen them at the gate, opening it for something that's not from this world. I can't describe it, but it's wrong. It's not alive, but it's not dead either. It's like nothing I've ever seen, and I can't get the image out of my head. They're letting it through, letting it out. And once it's out, there's no stopping it. I slammed the notebook shut, breathing hard. This couldn't be real. Kyle had to be losing his mind. But the thing is, Kyle was always the rational one, the one who kept a level head no matter what. If he was writing this, if he believed this, then a loud crash from outside my apartment made me jump, sending my heart into overdrive. I stood there frozen, listening intently, but all I could hear was the distant hum of traffic and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I was on edge, nerves frayed to the point of snapping. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, lurking in the shadows, something that had followed the package maybe, something that was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I spent the rest of the day glued to the windows, peeking through the blinds, watching for any sign of movement. Every time a car drove by or a branch scraped against the side of the building, I jumped out of my skin. I knew I should call someone, tell them what was going on, but who would believe me? Who would even understand what I was dealing with? The authorities, the military, they were probably all in on it, just like Kyle said. As night fell, the fear only grew stronger. I couldn't stay in my apartment, not with that notebook, not with the possibility that whatever Kyle had warned me about was real. So I packed a bag, grabbed the notebook, and bolted. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away from my place as possible. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a motel on the outskirts of a town I'd never even heard of. As I sat there in the dingy motel room, clutching the notebook like a lifeline, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Whatever Kyle had been trying to protect me from, it was too late now, because now I was involved, and there was no turning back. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old motel walls, every distant car horn, every gust of wind sounded like a threat. My mind was racing, trying to process everything I had read in Kyle's notebook. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, but at the same time, I knew that whatever was happening, whatever Kyle had warned me about, was real. I just didn't know how real it was about to get. Around 3 a.m., after hours of pacing the small, dimly lit room, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to read more of the notebook. As terrifying as the first few entries had been, the not knowing was worse. My hands trembled as I flipped to the next page, desperate for answers, but dreading what I might find. Entry 4. The others are starting to notice. I've seen them whispering to each other, casting glances in my direction. They know I'm onto them, that I'm not like the others. They've started messing with my head, making me see things, hear things that aren't there. But I know what's real. I know what I've seen. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. Was Kyle really seeing things, or were they doing something to him? I remembered that eerie feeling I had when I last spoke to him, like he was there, but not really there. What if they'd already started messing with his mind then? Entry 5. I found a way to record them. There's a camera feed hidden in the gatehouse, pointed at the entrance. I had to rig it myself, keep it hidden from the others. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, find the footage. It's the proof you'll need to believe me. The proof that they're not human. My heart raced as I read that last line. Proof. Kyle had found proof that something was going on at that base. Something beyond anything I could comprehend. But how was I supposed to get to it? And what if I wasn't the only one who knew about it? I set the notebook down and rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my head. My thoughts were spinning, a chaotic mess of fear, confusion, and dread. I was in way over my head, and I had no idea what to do next. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound coming from outside the motel room door. My blood ran cold as I froze in place, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scratching, like something sharp being dragged along the wooden door frame. I tiptoed over to the door, my breath caught in my throat. The room was silent, except for that maddening sound growing louder, more insistent. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock the door, to hide, but I needed to know what was out there. I grabbed the old metal lamp from the nightstand and held it like a weapon. Slowly, quietly, I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The scratching stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I waited, heart thudding in my chest, the seconds dragging on like hours. Then suddenly, the knob turned. I jumped back, nearly dropping the lamp. The door creaked open an inch, then two, then stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anything beyond the small crack, just the dark, empty corridor outside. For a moment, everything was still. Then without warning, the door swung open wide, revealing nothing but the shadowy hallway beyond. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No one. Just that oppressive, suffocating silence. I took a cautious step forward, lamp raised, ready to strike at the first sign of danger. The hallway was empty. I stood there, trembling, my mind struggling to make sense of what just happened. Who or what had opened the door? Was it a prank? Had I imagined the whole thing? But the fear gripping my chest told me otherwise. And then I saw it. A single crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor just outside the door. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it. With shaking hands, I bent down and picked it up, my eyes scanning the messy, scrawled writing. You can't hide from them. My blood ran cold. Whoever or whatever had left that note knew I was here. They were toying with me, letting me know they were watching. I stumbled back into the room, slamming the door shut behind me, heart racing. I knew I couldn't stay here. They'd found me. Whatever Kyle had warned me about, it was coming for me now. I needed to keep moving, needed to get somewhere safe, if there was any safe place left. I grabbed my bag, stuffed the notebook inside, and bolted out of the room, not bothering to look back. I raced to my car, my pulse hammering in my ears, my mind screaming at me to get as far away as possible. As I sped down the empty highway, the notebook's words echoed in my mind. I was in danger. Whoever or whatever was after Kyle was after me too. They knew I had the notebook. They knew I was onto them, and I had no idea how far they'd go to stop me. I drove for what felt like hours, the dark road stretching endlessly before me, swallowed up by the night. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The fear that had taken root in my chest back at the motel was growing, spreading like a poison through my veins. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, someone, following me. But the road behind was as empty as the one ahead. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was hunting me. But even as I fled, a nagging thought gnawed at the back of my mind. I couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to stop, to rest, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. That's when I saw it. A flickering neon sign up ahead, cutting through the darkness. It was an old diner, the kind you see in horror movies, the ones that are always empty except for a lone trucker or a weary waitress. But at that moment, it felt like a lifeline. I needed to gather my thoughts, to plan my next move. And I was starving. Fear had a way of making you forget the last time you ate. I pulled into the gravel lot and killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after the hours of driving. The neon sign buzzed and flickered as I approached the entrance, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked pavement. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the door handle, a part of me screaming that this was a bad idea, but I was too exhausted to listen. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, the warm air hitting me like a wave. The place was almost empty, just as I expected. A couple of booths lined the windows, and a long counter stretched along one side of the room. An old man sat at the far end, nursing a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the small TV mounted above the counter. He didn't even glance in my direction. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, gave me a nod as I took a seat at one of the booths. I slid the notebook onto the table, keeping one hand on it as if letting go would somehow make everything that had happened become real. The waitress shuffled over, a notepad in hand. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked, her voice flat, like she'd been doing this job for far too long. "Just coffee," I muttered. My stomach growled, but the idea of food made me nauseous. The waitress nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I opened the notebook again, flipping through the pages I'd already read, hoping to find something I had missed, something that could help me. But the words were the same, terrifying, cryptic, and offering no clear answers. The bell above the door jingled again, and I glanced up out of habit. A man had just walked in, tall and thin, with a weathered face that looked like it had seen more than its share of hard times. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather, and his eyes scanned the diner before settling on me. A cold shiver ran down my spine as he started walking toward my booth, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't recognize him, but something about the way he moved, the way he looked at me, set off alarm bells in my head. Without a word, he slid into the seat opposite me, his eyes never leaving mine. Up close, I could see the lines etched deep into his skin, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. He looked tired, but there was something else there too, something dark, something that made my pulse quicken with fear. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, though it was clear he didn't really care whether I minded or not. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down in front of me with a clatter. She gave the man a curious look, but didn't say anything, just shuffled back to the counter. For a moment, the man and I just sat there in silence, the only sound the low hum of the TV and the occasional clink of dishes from the kitchen. He didn't touch the menu, didn't even glance at it. His eyes were still fixed on me, like he was trying to read my thoughts. "You've been running, haven't you?" he said finally, his voice low and rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. My heart skipped a beat. How could he know that? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You've seen things, haven't you? Things you can't explain, things that have no business being real." I felt the blood drain from my face. How could he know? Was he one of them? Was he here to finish what they'd started? "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my voice shaking. A ghost of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile you give when you know something the other person doesn't. Don't play dumb with me, kid. You wouldn't be out here, in the middle of nowhere, running like a scared rabbit, if you didn't know exactly what I'm talking about. I opened my mouth to deny it again, but the words wouldn't come. He was right. I was running, and I didn't even know who or what I was running from. But this man, this stranger, seemed to know more about my situation than I did. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered notebook, much like the one Kyle had sent me. He slid it across the table toward me, and my breath caught in my throat as I realized it was covered in the same kind of scrawled, panicked handwriting as Kyle's. "Let's just say I've been where you are," he said, his voice low and grim, "and I know what you're up against." My hands trembled as I picked up the notebook, flipping it open to the first page. The writing was frantic, almost illegible, but I could make out a few words. "They're everywhere, watching, waiting. You can't trust anyone." My heart pounded in my chest as I looked up at the man. His eyes were dark, filled with a kind of sadness and weariness that I couldn't begin to understand. But beneath that, there was something else, something like fear. "You've seen them, haven't you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded slowly. "I've seen them. I've been running from them for years, but they always catch up eventually. That's why I'm here, to warn you, to help you if I can." "Help me how?" I asked, the fear in my chest giving way to a desperate hope. Maybe this man knew something I didn't, something that could save me. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's a way to stop them, but it's not easy, and it's not without risk. But if you want to survive, you'll have to take that risk." My mind raced as I tried to process what he was saying. Stop them? How? What risk was he talking about? I had so many questions, but before I could ask any of them, he stood up abruptly, his expression darkening. "They're coming," he said, his voice tense. "You need to go. Now." A wave of panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, clutching both notebooks in my hands. The man's eyes darted to the door, then back to me. "Don't trust anyone," he warned, his voice urgent. "And whatever you do, don't look back." With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, fear clawing at my chest. I didn't waste any time. I threw some cash on the table and bolted for the door, my mind screaming at me to run, to get as far away as possible. As I burst out into the night, the cool air hit me like a slap to the face. The parking lot was empty, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, every instinct telling me to get the hell out of there. But as I drove away, tires screeching on the asphalt, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the lot, barely visible in the dim light. They were watching me, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They didn't move, didn't chase after me. They just watched, like they knew something I didn't. And as I sped away into the night, I realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't going to stop. They weren't going to give up. No matter how far I ran, no matter how well I hid, they would always find me, because I had something they wanted, and they would do whatever it took to get it. I didn't stop driving until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and every muscle in my body ached with exhaustion and fear. The road had taken me deep into the desert, miles away from any sign of civilization. I pulled off onto a dusty, unmarked path, hoping it would lead me somewhere I could hide, at least for a little while. The stranger's words echoed in my mind. There's a way to stop them, but it's not easy, and it's not without risk. What risk? What did he know that I didn't? And who were those figures in the parking lot? Were they the ones Kyle had warned me about? I needed answers, but all I had were more questions, each more terrifying than the last. Eventually, the dirt path led me to an abandoned gas station, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in decades. The windows were boarded up, and the pumps were rusted and broken, but the building itself seemed sturdy enough. I parked the car around the back, out of sight, and grabbed the 2 notebooks before heading inside. The interior was just as dilapidated as the outside. Dusty shelves, empty coolers, and a cracked counter covered in cobwebs. I found a corner where the sunlight didn't quite reach and sat down, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I couldn't afford to panic. Not now. I opened Kyle's notebook again, flipping through the pages until I reached the last entry I hadn't read. My heart pounded as I read the words, the fear in his handwriting almost palpable. Entry 6. The gate is real. It's not just a metaphor or some military jargon. It's an actual gate, an entrance to another place, another world. I don't know what's on the other side, but it's not something meant for us. The things that come through, they're not natural. They're not human. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered the way Carl had sounded during our last call, the way his voice had trembled with fear. He knew what was on the other side of that gate, and it terrified him. And now, I was getting dragged into it. Entry 7. They're using it. The gatekeepers, the ones who aren't really human, they're using the gate to bring things through. Things that shouldn't exist in our world. They're not just soldiers or guards. They're something else entirely. Something old. Something that's been here long before us. I could hardly breathe as I read those words. Kyle had been trying to warn me, to protect me from whatever was coming through that gate. But now it was too late. I was in too deep, and the only way out was through. My hands shook as I flipped to the last page, hoping for some kind of clue, some hint of how I could stop this. But all I found were 3 words, scrawled hastily, the ink smeared as if Kyle had written them in a hurry. Find the gate. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Find the gate. How was I supposed to do that? And what would I do once I found it? I glanced at the stranger's notebook, still lying next to me. Maybe there was something in there that could help. With trembling hands, I opened the stranger's notebook and started reading. The entries were chaotic, disjointed, like the ramblings of a madman. But beneath the fear and paranoia, there was a common thread, a way to stop them. They need the gate to stay open. It's the only way they can bring their kind into our world. But the gate isn't indestructible. It's tied to something in our world. Find that, and you can close it. But be careful. Once you start, they'll know. And they'll do whatever it takes to stop you. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. This was the risk the stranger had warned me about. If I went after the gate, they would come for me. But if I didn't, whatever was on the other side would keep coming through, and there would be no stopping it. I didn't have a choice. I had to find the gate and destroy it, no matter the cost. The notebooks gave me a rough idea of where the gate might be, deep within the Nevada desert, near a cluster of old military bunkers. It wasn't far from Area 51, which made sense. They'd want to keep it close, to monitor it, to protect it, or to protect us from it. I didn't waste any time. I left the gas station and drove deeper into the desert, following the stranger's instructions. The landscape grew more barren, more desolate, as if the very earth itself was trying to warn me away. But I couldn't turn back now. After hours of driving, I finally saw it. A massive, rusted gate set into the side of a rocky hill, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. There were no guards, no cameras, nothing to indicate it was being monitored, but I knew better. They were watching. They were always watching. I parked the car a good distance away and approached on foot, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more I felt it. A strange, oppressive energy, like the air itself was thickening, trying to push me back. But I kept going, forcing myself to move forward, one step at a time. When I reached the fence, I found a small gap in the wire, just big enough to squeeze through. I pushed through, my heart racing, the fear in my chest almost overwhelming, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I pushed the gate slowly, the notebooks clutched in my hands. It was massive, much larger than I'd imagined, and made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb the light. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, symbols that hurt to look at, like they were burning themselves into my mind. As I stood there, staring up at the gate, I realized just how out of my depth I was. This wasn't something I could fight or destroy with brute force. It was ancient, powerful, and beyond anything I could understand. But I had to try. I flipped open the stranger's notebook, scanning the last few entries, looking for anything that could help. And then I found it. A passage that described a way to disrupt the gate's connection to our world. It wasn't much, just a few lines about an ancient symbol, a word of power, but it was all I had. I took a deep breath and began to trace the symbol in the dirt at my feet, my hands shaking as I worked. The air grew colder, the light dimming, as if the sun itself was retreating from the gate. I could feel them watching me, feel their presence growing stronger, closer. I spoke the word of power, my voice trembling. The sound echoed in the stillness, a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to shake. The gate shuddered, the symbols on its surface glowing with a sickly green light. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, like the growl of some enormous beast. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as the gate began to crack, the metal splintering, the light spilling out like toxic smoke. But as the gate began to collapse, I felt a presence behind me, a cold, malevolent force that filled me with dread. I turned, and there they were, the figures from the parking lot. Their eyes glowed with that same sickly light, their faces twisted into something that was almost human, but not quite. They moved toward me, silent and relentless, their steps slow but purposeful. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped between them and the gate. The ground shook violently, and the gate let out a deafening roar, the light flaring brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. The figures hesitated, their eyes flicking between me and the gate, as if they were trying to decide which was the greater threat. And then, with a final earth-shattering crash, the gate collapsed. The light exploded outward, washing over everything in a blinding flash. I threw my arms up, shielding my eyes, as the force of the blast knocked me off my feet. The world went white, and for a moment, I thought I was dead. But then, slowly, the light began to fade. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground, the gate nothing more than a pile of smoldering rubble. The figures were gone. vanished as if they had never been there. The oppressive energy that had filled the air was gone too, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of burnt metal. I staggered to my feet, my body aching, my mind reeling. I had done it. I had destroyed the gate. But at what cost? What had I unleashed? And where had the figures gone? As I stood there, staring at the ruins of the gate, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. I had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. There were others out there, other gates, other forces that would stop at nothing to break through. But for now, I was alive. And as long as I was alive, I would keep fighting, even if it meant running forever. I work as a gatekeeper on the Antarctica. I found this job on the dark web, and it's the worst decision I made so far. I never thought I'd end up in Antarctica, of all places. But then again, I never imagined I'd be the kind of person who'd browse the dark web either. I was broke, desperate, and just out of college, with a useless degree in something that sounded cool at the time, but didn't translate into any real-world skills. My job search had been one long series of rejections, and after months of getting nowhere, I was ready to consider anything. That's when I stumbled upon the ad. It was buried deep in one of the many hidden corners of the dark web, part of a forum thread that was mostly dead, save for this one post. High-paying remote job opportunity. No experience required, it read. I should have known better, right? If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But like I said, I was desperate. And when you're staring at an empty bank account and an eviction notice on the fridge, your judgment starts to slip. The job description was vague. It mentioned something about needing someone with a strong mental fortitude who could work in isolation for extended periods. It also promised a 6-figure salary for a year-long contract, all expenses paid. They didn't ask for a resume or references, just a brief statement about why you were interested in the position and a phone number where they could reach you. Without thinking too hard about it, I sent a quick email explaining that I was up for anything that paid well and would get me out of my current situation. I didn't expect much to come from it, maybe a scam or phishing attempt, but within 24 hours, I got a response. The email was from someone named Mr. Black. Yeah, I know, cliché, right? He said he was impressed by my willingness to step out of my comfort zone and wanted to arrange a phone interview. The next day, I found myself talking to this guy who sounded like he was calling from a tunnel. There was this weird echo, and his voice was deep and slow, like he was choosing every word carefully. The conversation was odd, to say the least. He asked me about my experience with isolation, if I had any health conditions, and whether I could keep secrets. He also asked some questions that seemed out of place, like how I felt about extreme temperatures and if I believed in the supernatural. I laughed at that last one, thinking it was some kind of joke, but Mr. Black didn't so much as chuckle. A week later, I had a plane ticket to New Zealand and a contract in my inbox that looked more like a non-disclosure agreement than anything else. It was filled with legal jargon about confidentiality, liabilities, and penalties for breaking the terms. But the number at the bottom was real enough, a staggering $120,000 for 1 year of work. They wired me an advance that was more money than I'd seen in months, and before I knew it, I was packing my bags. When I told my friends about the job, they all thought I was insane. You're going to Antarctica? Are you out of your mind? They were right, of course. But at the time, the excitement of the unknown, combined with the promise of a life-changing amount of money, was too much to pass up. I convinced myself that it was just some quirky research gig, maybe at a remote station that needed a caretaker. The flight to New Zealand was long and uneventful, and I spent most of it trying not to freak out about what I was getting myself into. Mr. Black had arranged everything: the flights, the accommodations, even a private charter that would take me to the work site, as he called it. He warned me that once I arrived, communication would be limited, but there would be regular check-ins to make sure everything was okay. I arrived in Christchurch, New Zealand, late at night. A driver was waiting for me at the airport with a sign that had my name on it, just like in the movies. He didn't say much, just drove me to a small, nondescript hotel on the outskirts of the city. The next morning, I was on a tiny plane, the kind with propellers that made me feel like I'd stepped back in time. We flew over endless stretches of ocean, and then, as we approached the icy continent, the pilot pointed out the window. "There it is," he said, his voice crackling over the headset. I looked out and saw nothing but white, miles and miles of frozen wilderness. It was beautiful, in a desolate kind of way, but also unnerving. There were no signs of life, no buildings or roads, just an endless sea of ice. It was like the world had ended, and I was the last person left alive. We landed on a strip of ice that served as a runway. As I stepped off the plane, the cold hit me like a punch to the gut. Even with all the gear they had provided, thermal layers, heavy boots, gloves, and a parka, I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. There was no one to greet me, just a small enclosed vehicle waiting a few yards away. The pilot pointed to it and said, "Your ride's here. Good luck, mate." Then he was gone, leaving me alone on the ice. I climbed into the vehicle, which was more like a small tank than a car, and the door hissed shut behind me. The driver was another silent type, and we drove for what felt like hours through the frozen wasteland. The sun never really set, just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow. Eventually, we arrived at what I assumed was my destination, a small, nondescript building, half buried in the ice. There were no windows, just a single metal door with a keypad next to it. The driver handed me a keycard and pointed to the door. I was on my own from here. As I stepped out into the cold and approached the door, I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. This was it, the moment where I'd find out what I'd really signed up for. I swiped the keycard and the door slid open with a mechanical hum. Inside was a narrow hallway, dimly lit and lined with metal walls. The air was warmer, but not by much, and there was a faint smell of something chemical, like cleaning supplies or ozone. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud, and I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that there was no turning back now. The hallway was long and unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in on you from all sides. I could hear my own breathing, a little too loud in the confined space, and the soft crunch of my boots on the metal floor. At the end of the corridor, there was another door, this one marked with a simple number, 13. There was no greeting, no "Welcome to your new job" message, just that cold, impersonal number. I hesitated for a moment, wondering what I might find on the other side, but then reminded myself that I was here to make a ridiculous amount of money. I'd dealt with worse, right? With a shaky hand, I pushed the door open. The room was small, about the size of a decent hotel room. but completely bare aside from a single bed, a desk with a chair and a locker. The walls were the same dull metallic gray as the hallway, with no windows, and the only light came from a fluorescent bulb in the ceiling that buzzed faintly. It wasn't exactly cozy, but it wasn't as bad as I'd imagined either. At least it was warm. I dropped my bags on the bed and took a moment to gather my thoughts. The room was basic, but it had everything I'd need. There was a bathroom through a door on the right, and when I opened the locker, I found it stocked with basic necessities, clothes, toiletries, and some vacuum-sealed meals. Everything was incredibly ordinary, considering I was in one of the most isolated places on Earth. I tried to connect to the internet on my phone, but there was no signal, just a dead screen. No Wi-Fi either. I hadn't really expected there to be, but it still felt unsettling. I was completely cut off from the outside world. There was no clock, so I couldn't tell what time it was, but I was exhausted from the journey and decided to try and get some sleep. I lay down on the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system. The room was dimly lit, the kind of dim that made the shadows in the corners look darker than they really were. I don't know how long I lay there, trying to convince myself to sleep, but it felt like hours. My mind kept drifting to the weirdness of the whole situation, the cryptic job offer, the remote location, the complete lack of human contact. I kept telling myself that this was just the price of the paycheck, that everything would be fine, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something was off. Just as I was starting to drift off, there was a noise. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of that room, it might as well have been an explosion, a low, rhythmic thudding, like someone was knocked on a distant door. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from somewhere outside the room, faint but persistent. I couldn't tell which direction it was coming from, and that only made it worse. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect in a place like this. No machinery, no wind howling through the frozen landscape. It was too deliberate, too human. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed and opened the door to the hallway. The sound was clearer now, still distant, but definitely coming from somewhere within the building. I stepped into the corridor, my breath catching in my throat as I realized how much darker it was out here. The dim lights that had lined the hallway when I first arrived were now flickering, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The thudding continued, a steady rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate through the metal structure. It felt like it was coming from the end of the corridor, beyond the door marked 13, where I'd entered earlier. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to lock myself in the room and wait until morning, or whatever passed for morning in this place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that maybe this was some kind of test, or worse, that someone else was out here. I walked slowly down the hallway, the sound growing louder with each step. It had a strange, almost hypnotic quality to it, like the beat of a drum or the pounding of a heartbeat. When I reached the end of the corridor, I saw that there was another door, unmarked and slightly ajar. The noise was definitely coming from behind it, louder now, almost deafening in the otherwise silent building. My hand was trembling as I reached out to push the door open, half expecting something out of a nightmare to jump out at me. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. Just another empty room, identical to mine, with the same bed, desk, and locker. The only difference was that this room was dark, the light bulb overhead flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the floor. And yet, the thudding continued, even louder now, echoing around the room, like it was coming from all directions at once. I stepped inside, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was impossible. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the walls, vibrating through the floor. My skin prickled with unease, and I realized I was holding my breath. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was so abrupt, it left my ears ringing. I stood there frozen, waiting for something to happen, but the room remained still, the shadows unmoving. I took a step back, my heart racing, and that's when I noticed it. Something was different about this room. It wasn't obvious at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw it. Scratches, deep and jagged, carved into the metal walls. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the surfaces like something or someone had been clawing at them in a desperate attempt to get out. My stomach churned as I realized the implications. Before I could process what I was seeing, the door behind me slammed shut with a loud bang, plunging the room into complete darkness. I spun around, but the handle wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic surged through me, and I started pounding on the door, shouting for help, even though I knew no one would hear me. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on all sides, and in the silence, I swore I could hear something breathing, something just out of sight, watching me. Then from somewhere in the pitch black, I heard it again. The thudding, but this time, it wasn't distant. It was right next to me, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as if the entire room was alive, pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't my own. I backed into a corner, my hands shaking, and in that moment, I felt something cold and wet under my fingers. I pulled my hand back instinctively and fumbled for my phone, using the screen to cast a faint light. The walls weren't just scratched. They were smeared with something dark and sticky, something that looked a lot like blood. That's when I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't alone in that room. I don't know how long I stayed in that corner, my back pressed against the cold, slick walls, my phone's weak light, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each minute feeling like an eternity. The thudding had stopped again, leaving only my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart echoing in my ears. I tried to tell myself that the blood smeared on the walls wasn't real, that it was some kind of trick my mind was playing on me in the darkness, but the cold, sticky sensation still clung to my fingers, and the acrid, metallic smell hung heavy in the air, making it hard to breathe. I knew I couldn't stay in that room forever. The door was still shut tight, but there had to be a way out. I just needed to think, to focus. But every time I tried to calm down, to come up with a plan, the silence would close in around me, oppressive and thick, making my thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. Then from somewhere deep in the building, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more distinct. A low, whispering voice, echoing through the walls. I couldn't make out the words at first, just a soft, insistent murmuring, like someone speaking just out of earshot. But as it continued, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. "Help me, please, help me." The voice was hoarse, desperate, and filled with a kind of raw fear that sent chills down my spine. It sounded close, too close, like whoever was speaking was right there in the room with me, hidden in the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse hammering in my ears. The voice continued, now accompanied by a faint scratching noise, like fingernails on metal. The sound made my skin crawl, and I fought the urge to cover my ears. Help me! It's coming! It's coming for me! It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were several now, all overlapping, whispering the same plea over and over. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. My head was spinning, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I needed to get out of there, but the door was still shut tight, the handle cold and unyielding in my grip. In a moment of blind panic, I turned and slammed my shoulder against the door, hoping to break it down, but it didn't budge. The voices grew louder, more frantic, their whispers turning into harsh, rasping cries. Please, help, don't leave me here. It's coming. It's coming. I backed away from the door, with my mind racing. I had to find another way out, something I hadn't noticed before. My phone's light flickered and then went out, plunging the room into complete darkness again. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to turn it back on, but it was dead. The battery had drained faster than it should have, and now I was alone in the dark, surrounded by those damned voices. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl rising up from the depths of the building, vibrating through the walls. It was deep, almost inhuman, and it reverberated in my chest like the roar of a distant storm. The voices fell silent, as if whatever was out there had frightened them into submission. The growl grew louder, more intense, until it was all I could hear. It was coming closer, moving through the walls, through the floors, searching for something, searching for me. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, as if that could somehow keep me hidden. My mind was racing, my thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion. What the hell had I gotten myself into? This was supposed to be just a weird job in a remote place, not whatever this was. The growling stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and impossibly slow. They were close now, just outside the door, and I could hear something dragging across the floor, like claws scraping against the metal. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then with a loud metallic screech, the door handle began to turn. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, as the door slowly creaked open. A sliver of dim light spilled into the room, illuminating the scratched walls and the bloodstains. My eyes were locked on the doorway, dreading what I might see, but there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness. For a moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. I couldn't believe it. There was no one there, no monstrous figure lurking in the shadows. Just an open door leading back into the cold, silent corridor. I didn't wait for an explanation. I bolted from the room, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls as I ran. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows shifting and writhing as I passed. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away from that room as possible. I turned corner after corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I finally stumbled into a larger room, a control center of some kind, filled with monitors and equipment. The screens were dark, the buttons unlit, but it was a relief just to be out of the narrow, oppressive corridors. I leaned against a wall, trying to catch my breath, when I noticed something on one of the desks, a map, or what looked like one, pinned under a stack of papers. I hurried over and flipped through the mess, trying to make sense of it. The map showed the layout of the building, a sprawling underground complex that stretched far beyond what I had imagined. There were sections labeled with numbers and strange symbols, rooms marked with red X, and long, twisting corridors that seemed to go on forever. But what caught my eye was a section near the bottom, marked with a word that sent a chill down my spine. Containment. Before I could think about what that meant, I heard the growl again, this time much closer. It was coming from the corridor I had just escaped from, the sound growing louder, and with each passing second, I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the map and bolted for the nearest door, my mind racing. Whatever was down here with me, it was getting closer, and I had no intention of sticking around to find out what it wanted. I ran through the maze of corridors, the growling and the footsteps echoing behind me, always just a little too close for comfort. The map was my only guide, leading me deeper into the complex, toward a section that wasn't marked with red X's or strange symbols. The whispers had started again, now louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to warn me, to tell me something I didn't want to hear. Turn back, turn back. It's coming. But I couldn't turn back. The thing, whatever it was right behind me, its growls turning into a snarling roar. I could feel it gaining on me, its presence like a dark cloud, cold and suffocating. Finally, I reached a door at the end of a long, narrow corridor. It looked sturdier than the others, made of thick, reinforced metal, with a keypad next to it. I fumbled for the key card Mr. Black had given me and swiped it through the reader. The door clicked open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I could hear the thing on the other side, scratching at the metal, its growls turning into a frustrated, angry howl. But the door held. I was safe. For now. The room I had entered was different from the others. It was larger, with thick insulated walls and no windows. There were no beds, no lockers, just a single chair in the center of the room, facing a large screen mounted on the wall. On the screen was a message, glowing in the darkness. Welcome to containment. The watch begins. And below that, a countdown timer, slowly ticking down from 48, 0 o'clock. 2 days. I had 2 days to survive. The cold blue light of the countdown timer cast eerie shadows across the room, making the walls seem like they were pulsing in and out with each passing second. I stood there, staring at those numbers ticking down, my breath ragged and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. 48 hours. That's how long I had to survive. But survive what, exactly? And why did it feel like the walls were closing in on me, as if the room itself was aware of my presence? I forced myself to take a deep breath and try to make sense of the situation. There had to be some reason for the countdown, something connected to whatever the hell was roaming the halls outside. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The map I'd grabbed earlier was still clutched in my hand, crumpled and damp with sweat. I unfolded it, desperate for answers, anything that could help me get through the next 2 days. The section labeled Containment was marked in bold, and as I scanned the map, I realized that this area was isolated from the rest of the facility. There were only 2 access points, one I'd come through, and another at the opposite end of the complex. But between those 2 points were a series of rooms and corridors labeled with names that sent a shiver down my spine. Observation, quarantine, holding. I could barely process it. I wasn't just in some random research station. This place had been designed to hold something dangerous enough to require all this security. But what was it? And where the hell was everyone else? My thoughts were interrupted by a soft click behind me, and I spun around to see the screen on the wall flicker to life. The image was grainy, black and white, like something out of an old security camera feed. It showed a long, empty corridor, the one I'd just come from, stretching into darkness. For a moment, I thought the feed was on a loop, nothing but static silence and flickering lights. But then, I saw movement. Something was in the corridor just beyond the camera's view. It was subtle at first, a shadow that seemed to shift and grow, like it was bleeding into the walls themselves. I squinted at the screen, trying to make out what it was, but it was like looking through a fog. And then, just for a second, I saw it. A shape, hunched and crawling, its limbs too long, too twisted to be human. I recoiled in horror, the chair behind me clattering to the ground. The thing on the screen paused, as if it had heard the noise, and then its head snapped up, fixing the camera with what I could only describe as eyes, dark, empty voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. It started moving again, faster this time, lurching down the corridor with an unnatural, jerky gait. My stomach turned, and I tore my eyes away from the screen, refusing to watch any longer. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, hunting, and I was stuck in here with no idea how to stop it. But then, something else caught my eye. Below the main screen, a smaller monitor blinked to life, displaying a list of numbered rooms, each corresponding to a location on the map. Next to each room number was a status indicator: active, inactive, breach. Most of them were marked inactive, except for two that were flashing breach in an ominous red. I quickly matched the numbers to the map. The breached rooms were in the section labeled holding, which meant whatever had been contained there was now loose. And it wasn't alone. There were two of them, roaming the facility, and from the look of the screen, they were heading straight toward me. Panic surged through me again, and I frantically searched the room for something, anything that could help. My eyes fell on a metal cabinet in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. I rushed over and yanked it open, praying for a miracle. Inside, I found a collection of tools: screwdrivers, wrenches, a crowbar, and at the bottom, a small black case with a faded label. I grabbed the case and opened it, revealing a device that looked like a handheld radio, but with a series of dials and switches I didn't recognize. There was a note inside, scrawled in shaky handwriting: emergency frequency scanner. Use only as a last resort. Do not engage without proper authorization. I had no idea what it did, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. I stuffed the scanner into my pocket, grabbed the crowbar, and headed back to the door. I needed to move, to find a way out of this nightmare before those things found me. I cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. The corridor was empty, the same cold metal walls and flickering lights stretching out into the darkness. I could hear the low hum of the ventilation system, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Clutching the map in one hand and the crowbar in the other, I stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind me, and I forced myself to move, one cautious step at a time, listening for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat, every distant creak making me jump. As I moved deeper into the facility, the lights grew dimmer, the corridors more narrow and twisted. It felt like the building itself was alive, shifting and changing to confuse me. But the map was my lifeline, guiding me toward the far end of the complex, where the second exit was supposed to be. I reached a section marked observation and hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. I couldn't hear anything from inside, but the silence was almost worse than noise. With my heart pounding in my chest, I nudged the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, filled with monitors and control panels, all dark except for one screen that was flickering with static. There were chairs scattered around, one of them knocked over, and the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and something else, something acrid and metallic. I moved closer to the active monitor, my pulse quickening as the static cleared just enough to show another live feed. This one was focused on a large windowless room with a single figure standing in the center. I squinted at the screen, trying to make out the details. The figure was human, at least it looked human, but something was wrong. It was standing perfectly still, its back to the camera, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and then slowly it began to turn, its movements jerky and mechanical, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. When it finally faced the camera, I felt my blood run cold. The figure's face was blank, featureless, like a mannequin with no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. And yet, as I stared at it, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if those empty eye sockets were looking right through the screen, seeing me. The figure's head twitched, and then it began to move toward the camera, its limbs bending and snapping in unnatural ways. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The thing on the screen reached out, its hand pressing against the camera lens, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was going to pull itself through the screen and into the room with me. But then the screen went black, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening, and I realized I had been holding my breath the entire time. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the faint light, was another door, slightly ajar, and through that narrow gap, I could see movement, a shadowy figure creeping toward me, its limbs contorted and twisted, just like the thing on the screen. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me and sprinting down the corridor. The lights flickered overhead, and I could hear footsteps behind me, fast and uneven, like something was lurching after me in the dark. I didn't dare look back. I followed the map, my heart pounding in my ears, until I reached a stairwell leading down into the lower levels. The air grew colder, the walls more oppressive as I descended into the bowels of the facility. The footsteps were still behind me, closer now, and I could hear that same low growl echoing through the halls. Finally, I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a long, narrow hallway, the walls lined with heavy, reinforced doors. This was it. Containment. Whatever they had been keeping down here, it was meant to stay locked away, and I had just walked right into its lair. The doors were all marked with the same symbols I had seen on the map, strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them. I could hear the voices again, louder this time, pleading and desperate. "Help! It's coming! Please help!" But there was no one to help. The footsteps were right behind me now, and I knew I didn't have much time. I ran to the end of the corridor, where a final door stood slightly open, light spilling out into the dark hallway. I didn't have a choice. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large and circular, with a high domed ceiling and walls lined with strange pulsing lights. In the center of the room was a control panel, and above it, suspended in a glass chamber, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a figure, but unlike anything I had seen before. Its body was twisted, limbs elongated and misshapen, with patches of skin missing, revealing raw, pulsing muscle underneath. Its face was a grotesque mask of agony, eyes wide and mouth twisted in a silent scream. But what was worse, what made my stomach churn and my vision blur, was the fact that I recognized it. Despite the disfigurement, the mutilation, I knew who it was. It was me. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. The twisted, grotesque figure suspended in the glass chamber couldn't be real, couldn't be me. But there it was, a horrifying reflection of what I could become, of what I would become if I didn't find a way out of this nightmare. The thing in the chamber, my distorted twin, wasn't just still, it was alive. I could see the shallow rise and fall of its chest, the twitching of its two long fingers as they curled against the glass, trying in vain to reach out. Its eyes, my eyes, were wide and full of a silent, unending agony, as if it was trapped in some eternal torment. I could feel its pain, a deep, primal terror that clawed at my mind, threatening to pull me under. I had to force myself to look away, to tear my gaze from the abomination that was somehow impossibly me. The room was filled with that same oppressive silence, broken only by the faint hum of the machines and the distant, ever-present growl that seemed to resonate from the very walls themselves. I stumbled toward the control panel, my hands shaking uncontrollably. There had to be something here, some explanation, some way to stop this madness. The controls were covered in strange symbols, the same ones I'd seen on the doors and the map, but they seemed to shift and change every time I tried to focus on them. I flipped through the switches and dials, my movements frantic and desperate. One of the screens flickered to life, displaying a series of logs and data entries, but they were filled with cryptic code and jargon that made no sense to me. Yet, amidst the incomprehensible text, a single line stood out, highlighted in red. Containment Protocol. Initiate Phase 3. Phase 3. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it couldn't be good. Whatever was happening here, whatever had been done to that thing in the chamber, whatever was happening to me, it was part of some twisted experiment, something beyond my worst nightmares. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the radio scanner I'd taken from the cabinet. I didn't know how to use it, but I didn't care. I fumbled with the dials, trying to find any frequency that might offer help, or at least an explanation. The static buzzed and crackled, and for a moment I thought it was hopeless. But then, through the white noise, I heard a voice, a clear, steady voice that made my blood run cold. This is Control. Subject 13 has breached containment. Initiating emergency protocol. Subject 13. That was me. I was Subject 13. My mind reeled as the reality of my situation hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just a gatekeeper, some unlucky guy who'd stumbled into a bad situation. I was the experiment, the thing that had been kept locked away in this frozen hellhole. The voice continued, emotionless and clinical, as if it was reading off a checklist. Subject 13 exhibits advanced metamorphic capabilities. Physical transformation is 70% complete. Subject shows signs of cognitive instability. Recommended action, neutralization, neutralization. They were going to kill me. I was nothing but a failed experiment, a liability to be erased. Panic surged through me, and I frantically searched the control panel for anything, any way to stop what was coming. But before I could do anything, the lights in the room flickered, and the ground beneath me shook violently. Alarms blared, deafening and shrill, echoing through the chamber as the walls seemed to vibrate with the force of the sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling, and that's when I noticed the figure in the glass chamber, my doppelganger, beginning to move more violently. It thrashed against the restraints, its body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, as if it was trying to break free. The glass began to crack, thin lines spiderwebbing across the surface. I backed away, the reality of my situation crushing down on me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. If that thing got out, if I got out, there was no telling what kind of destruction it could unleash. I didn't know what I was becoming, but I knew it was something monstrous, something that should never have existed. The countdown timer on the screen was now ticking down rapidly, the numbers flashing red as the alarms blared. I had minutes, maybe seconds, before whatever final protocol had been set in motion would be completed. I ran to the door, the one that led back into the hallway, but it was locked, sealed tight by the emergency protocol. I was trapped. The only way out was through the chamber, through the thing that was still thrashing inside, now pounding on the glass with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and I was thrown to the floor by the force of the explosion. Shards of glass rained down around me, and I could feel the cold, wet splatter of something thick and dark on my face. I wiped it away, my hands trembling, as I looked up and saw the thing, me, emerge from the shattered chamber. It was worse up close, the grotesque parody of my own body twisted and malformed, with patches of skin hanging loose and muscles pulsing beneath. It looked at me with those empty, hollow eyes, and for a moment, we were both still, both locked in a shared understanding of the horror that had been done to us. Then it lunged. I scrambled to my feet, barely dodging its grasp as it swiped at me with claws that had once been hands. I ran to the control panel, my fingers flying over the switches and buttons in a desperate attempt to find something, anything, that could stop it. There was a lever on the side, large and red, with a label I couldn't read. Without thinking, I yanked it down. The room was suddenly filled with a deafening roar as the floor beneath the creature opened up, revealing a deep, dark pit. The thing, I, staggered, teetering on the edge, its malformed limbs flailing as it tried to keep its balance. I watched, breathless, as it let out a horrible, guttural scream, a sound that was more pain than anger, more sorrow than rage. Then with one final, desperate lunge, it fell into the pit, disappearing into the darkness below. The roar of the machinery faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The alarm stopped, and the countdown on the screen blinked to 0 before vanishing altogether. I was alone again, the only sound, my own ragged breathing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process everything that had just happened. My reflection in the glass, the twisted figure, the voice on the radio. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, but this was real. I had been part of something terrible, something that had nearly destroyed me, literally. The door behind me clicked, and I turned to see it slowly open, the seal broken by whatever I had triggered with the lever. The hallway beyond was dark and empty, the way out now clear. I walked through the door, my body numb, my mind blank. I had no plan, no idea where I would go or what I would do next. All I knew was that I needed to get out of this place, to leave it behind forever. The corridors seemed longer now, the shadows deeper, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, following the map in my mind, the layout burned into my memory. The facility was silent. No more growls, no more footsteps, just the oppressive quiet that had been there all along. Finally, I reached the exit, the heavy metal door that led to the outside world. I pushed it open, and the cold air hit me like a wall, sharp and biting. But I welcomed it, the sting of reality after the madness I had just endured. I stepped out into the snow, the vast empty expanse of Antarctica stretching out before me. The sky was a pale gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds, and the wind howled in the distance. I was alone, truly alone, but it was better than the alternative. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The facility behind me was a tomb, a place of horrors that needed to be forgotten. I knew that, even if I survived this, I would never be the same. The image of that twisted figure, the thing that had once been me, would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I walked into the frozen wilderness, leaving that nightmare behind, I realized that the worst part wasn't the fear or the pain or even the knowledge of what I had become. The worst part was knowing that somewhere out there in the dark, there were others like me, others who would never find their way out, others who would never escape the nightmare. And as I disappeared into the endless white, I couldn't help but wonder if I had really escaped it all.